To have a voiced or silent protagonist may not seem like much of a controversy on its face, but you'd be surprised how heated this conversation can get. Many feel very strongly one way or the other, which can make the topic quite polarizing whenever it's brought up. You might have heard recently about how Bethesda's upcoming Starfield will have a silent protagonist, and how there was a mixed response to the news from the community of people looking forward to the game. I tend to side more with the camp that believes the protagonist should remain silent, but I'm not 100% on that given there have been some really good exceptions with well-voiced protagonists. Still, we're talking mostly about role-playing games here on this channel, so it's going to get a lot more complicated than just thinking of voiced protagonists as the proper image of a polished and modern game. I think we can talk about this in a civilized manner, though, and break down the boundaries of this feisty topic. So let's get into it. I'm going to really dive into this topic in every way that I can, to give everyone a good idea of why us old school types feel the way that we do. Granted, I'll make the disclaimer that I don't speak for everyone, just myself, and I've been gaming since 1987, give or take, when I first got my hands on an Atari. It all started with systems that could barely handle any graphics, really. And with such limited space, how could these games even consider voicing lines? In fact, the goal was usually to try and make a better game, one with better graphics and more enjoyable gameplay. Even better music, all while dealing with the constraints of the current system. But even back then, we didn't get the wonderful choruses that we enjoy today. No, we had MIDIs. And they used to play those MIDIs on loop. That song from Final Fantasy VII that they played during Rufus's parade still gives me nightmares. But even still, we knew that gaming was just going to keep getting better and better. We had already seen it proven on so many occasions, and many gamers were looking to constant boundary pushers like Squaresoft, for instance, to make the graphics even better than they had been before. Now, I'm going to go on a major side rant here, but believe me, it does connect together with the history of gaming itself. My generation, Gen X, was probably one of the most adaptable generations out there because we grew up when all of this was first coming together. How ironic is it that we've basically been deleted by history, where all our songs end up on YouTube's millennial mixtape playlist? Even though a millennium literally means 1,000 years, so millennials were supposed to be kids born around the year 2000, while Gen X was born in the 70s and early 80s. Now they try to say that millennials go back as far as 1981, which is just made-up garbage. I remember when they started using the term millennials, and it wasn't until after the year 2000 when those children were much older and driving us crazy in MMOs. But I digress. So who was Gen X? Well, imagine a whole generation of people that grew up playing outside, unattended, and were generally ignored by their boomer parents, which made us, well, independent. But it also made us dislike our parents. Which is why it gets really old when kids call you a boomer thinking that all old people must be boomers. I mean, I was preparing my own meals by 6, even if they were just crappy TV dinners, and I could also do my own laundry. Most parents today would probably ask how it's even possible that I managed to survive, let alone avoid being kidnapped when I was roaming the streets from daylight to sundown. But not only were we capable of taking care of ourselves domestically, we were also introduced to technology like video games, and by the time most of us born in the 80s were 10, older for those born in the 70s, of course, we gained access to computers and then home computers. We watched the rise and what some might argue the fall of gaming, and it's not over yet. But the whole point of this tangent was to demonstrate how adaptable my generation was and still is. Sure, we can become complacent or get used to something a certain way, but we're also very capable of adjusting to new situations and technology, because new isn't always a bad thing to us. Gen X lives with one foot in the past and one foot in the future, and we always have. That makes us capable of seeing both sides of the spectrum in many different ways. and it puts us in a league of our own as far as I'm concerned. And yet nobody ever listens to us. These big-time game companies act like it's more important to please new generations coming in, even though many of us are sitting on careers and money and have no problem spending said money when there is a product we want to buy. Just look at how successful the Resident Evil remakes were to get an idea of what happens when they actually make something we want. Then you get monstrosities like Final Fantasy VII Remake that takes a game we loved and turns it into trash. That's the wrong way to do it. It may be that more times than not, we get ignored by these companies because we're not super pushy. That's mostly because we were brought up during one of the chillest periods in time. That, and because many of us were conditioned by our parents that nobody really gave a crap about what we had to say anyway. But trust me, I'm actually bringing this all back to the original topic. It is relevant because Gen X can appreciate all of the things that newer generations can in a way that boomers never could. And we can also appreciate old games, or let's say old ways, because we still remember when that was the only way. 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future. I have to say, I really like that perspective. But now that I've finally gotten that across, let's continue talking about the history of gaming. You see, there were no voiced protagonists for the longest time because in most cases the system couldn't handle it, and there just wasn't enough space for it. So it became the norm that in RPGs, the main character did not talk. In fact, none of the characters usually did. You made your own voices, and to be honest, it was pretty fun, for me at least.
Ah! He went that way. Your orders are to allow nobody to leave the village.
Stop!
You can't escape, fool! Ha 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 ha! Kill! Burn! Die, you spineless worms!
See? Fun! Now, the first game that comes to mind when I think about hearing actual voices in a game is Resident Evil. And that game was infamous for how bad the voice acting was.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
But Chris's...
What is it?
It was so bad, even though you were enthralled by the idea of hearing an actual human voice, you couldn't help but laugh. And then there were some incredible results, like the Jill sandwich.
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
And even still, other games, like the popular Final Fantasy series, was not voiced for quite a while. I don't think they actually voiced the characters until Final Fantasy X, which was released here in the US in 2002. So voices in RPGs are still a relatively new concept, which is what makes it so surprising to me that people have become so hung up on the idea of voicing a protag, considering it has never really been the norm. Now, let's take a look at another more modern game series, Dragon Age. The first title, Origins, came out in 2009, and while other characters were voiced, the protagonist remained silent. I think this worked incredibly well considering you were allowed to play several different races for an origin story. Then, in a sharp twist, when Dragon Age 2 came out, not only were you race-locked to a human, but your hawk was now voiced.
Perhaps we'll be lucky, and they'll run out of Darkspawn.
I probably don't have the popular opinion here because I've heard many sing the praises of Dragon Age 2 for the voice acting, but I hated my hawk's voice and the things she said. In fact, Dragon Age 2 to this day is my least favorite of the series, and the voice used by my hawk has a lot to do with it. There are other reasons too, like the recycling of areas, but at the end of the day, I could not associate with my hawk's voice at all. Many times I would pick an option only to hear my hawk rattle off some smarmy or sarcastic or whiny reply. It always felt off, and that was the problem with it. It's not the voice actor's fault per se, but there is no way to completely intuit what the player will think or feel about what they choose to say. You might choose it thinking that you're saying something coy, and then you turn around and insult the person bluntly, and it makes you feel rather put off because that's not what you wanted to do or what you wanted to say. I ended up despising my hawk because she was like some kind of exaggerated version of herself, and she was her own character. There were very few times when I felt like she represented me and what I wanted. Whereas in Origins, you never saw the choices you made spoken aloud, so there was no chance for misinterpretation. You simply saw how the characters you talked to reacted. And sure, there can still be mix-ups, sometimes, but for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. And that's the biggest issue you run into when you voice a protag, especially in an RPG, and that's that if the player doesn't associate with the image created, the voice used, then it's going to completely ruin the experience for them. Dragon Age 2 sucked for me because there was no me, there was only Hawk. And that leads to another sticking point for me, that most of the time, especially in fantasy games, when the main protagonist is voiced, they almost always have a British accent. And no, I don't have anything against England, so don't go there. I'm simply saying that just because I speak English doesn't mean I associate with that kind of an accent for my characters, and I don't think it always makes sense to include it as the sole voice for a protag. I mean, let's consider that the USA is pretty dang big. And even within England, there are so many dialects. I mean, seriously, check this out. I found this website called Idea, where they archive all of the English dialects. It's quite impressive, honestly, so if you want to check out the website, I'll add it down below in the info so you can do that. And for England alone, there are so many. There's Devon, which I don't even know if I'm saying that right, Wiltshire, Surrey, Suffolk, Yorkshire. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And so it makes sense that considering America is like way bigger, that they would have their own accents and dialects too. In fact, you can check them out on this Idea site as well. But even if you went with an American accent, there are so many of them. I've lived in the Northeast and in the South and even the Midwest. They all have their own dialects, and so the easy answer is that to keep everyone happy, the best way is to not voice it at all, because it would simply take too much time, money, and energy to make enough selection that there would be something that works for everyone. And I know many in favor of the English accent will just say, well, there was no America in the Middle Ages, the stage that most fantasy games are set in. But that's besides the point. There are Americans now. And let's also consider that most other countries have their own voices and languages too. Everyone else is going to get their own localization, and yet we're still being localized with England as a matter of convenience. When you consider just how many voices you would have to add, how does it make any sense to waste so many resources on voicing the protagonist? And why bother with a million different voices when your imagination can be so much better? I personally love to imagine the voice my character has. So far, I've had several tabletop characters, and in every instance, that character has had a different origin story. My first ever character was in Battletech, a Kuritan noble who is basically the equivalent of future space Japanese in Battletech. So I gave her my best attempt at a Japanese voice speaking English. Think Takemura from Cyberpunk. But female. I'm probably horrible at it, but at least she always says exactly what I intend for her to say. My latest character is a Northwind Highlander, which is a faction based off of the Scottish people, and I try my best to give her the full-on Scottish slang and accent by saying something like, "Aye, you're a numpty bawpeg." I'm not the best, but I've learned a lot of Scottish swears and slang, and I have taken to saying shite instead of shit, which is pretty cool, I guess. My point is that you can make that character be whatever you want it to be. Why be minimized to one voice when you could be any voice? And let's be realistic, just as my Battletech characters came from different factions, so too do all of the races of all of our fantasy games. Tieflings, dwarves, Githyanki, Canari, Antevans, Drow. Should they all sound exactly the same? How does that make any kind of sense? And yet, in games like Dragon Age, they take the time to make the variation. Antevans have their own accent, and dwarves do too in Baldur's Gate, but you can't pick those voices for your own character. So my argument is that if you can't do it right, then don't do it. If you're going to hurt the game by forcing your players into a very specific niche when they should be allowed to roam freely and be creative, then don't do it. And if one crowd demands that their protag must have a voice and it is your intention to listen to them, then why not add a little checkbox that turns it off for the rest of us who don't want to hear that voice? Sometimes I think that's the only answer to make everyone happy, but you can't deny how much time and money is wasted by voicing the protag, and how much that takes away from other areas of development that could actually serve to make the game better. Everyone talks about how they want more from games. They want more story, more impactful choices, they want more enjoyable gameplay, and yet people are so hung up on this one feature that doesn't affect the quality of the game. But so often I see people talking about games with a silent protag as though it's the sign of a bad game, when that couldn't be farther from the truth. Think about all of the options you had in Origins. Sometimes there were 6 choices on the screen, and think about how voicing all of those lines in Dragon Age 2 limited the choices. It became nice, mean, and sarcastic, and that was it. That's not enough to make a character you're role-playing feel real and three-dimensional. But like I mentioned earlier, there are definitely games I've played where I feel that the voiced protagonist served the game well, or well enough. One prime example is Fallout 4. I know not everyone enjoyed that game for several different reasons, but I didn't have trouble associating with that voice in my game. It felt like it matched what I wanted to say most of the time. I think the problem arises when the voiced character is saying what you don't want them to say, more often than not, or so often that it puts you off. I think even Mass Effect worked really well, because you played as a military commander, basically. And so having a tight, stern, deep voice made sense if you were trying to get into that role. But there were still times that I didn't agree with how my Shep said things. At least it was very minimal, though. If you asked me if I thought it hurt or helped the game overall, I'd say it probably helped. I liked my Shep's voice. I just think it's hard to hit that note all the time with everyone. And honestly, I'm not sure how much of an RPG Mass Effect even is. It kind of toes the line. And then there are some games where I can't even fathom the thought of a voiced protag, like The Legend of Zelda, for instance. Link has really never had a voice besides his hup and ha. I think if they voiced Link, it would really weird me out, because how could they ever come up with a voice that makes sense for him after a lifetime of being silent? But wait, there is one exception. Do you guys remember that classic Zelda cartoon?
Well, excuse me, princess.
I would totally be okay with that being Link's voice, just so you know. Once in a while, you even have these weird in-between moments where a game goes from a silent protag to suddenly being voiced, like in Warframe. I don't want to spoil the game for anyone who hasn't played it yet, so I'm going to be purposefully vague here. But the character you play as has always been mostly quiet, and in recent iterations of the story, they've suddenly been voiced. What's weirder is that it feels like it keeps changing. Like the last story update I played, the voice sounded different than the latest patch I played, and that can get really unsettling. It makes me wish they had just kept my character quiet, or at least mostly silent, instead of moving into a mostly voiced position. And, you know, I did talk about Dragon Age earlier, and I left out the latest installment, Inquisition. In that game, they had the typical British voice actor, but they also added an American one. In most cases, I'd say this was a move in the right direction, but the American female voice was just too deep for my tastes. I think I used it once when I made a Qunari Inquisitor, because it felt more appropriate to me personally, but if I'm playing an elf or a human, no way, that voice was way too low. So I guess my advice would be, if you're going to voice it, make the voice as straight down the middle average as possible, like no heavy accent, not too high, not too deep, just run-of-the-mill generic. And it would be less likely to cause any major problems with fussy people like me, you know, or just make them silent and save the time and energy for other things. All of this talk of voiced or silent protags has reminded me of a fun story. Did you guys know that BG3 originally had a fully voiced protagonist instead of the narrator we know and love today? It was narrated in the past tense by whoever you played as, Tav or any of the Origin characters. But the community disliked it so much that eventually Larian gave in and changed it to what we have today, with the narrator in the present tense. But there are still some signs of the voice left in the game today, like after Edwin dies. Can you imagine the game without the narrator, though? Because I certainly can't. And I actually really appreciate that my Tav stays quiet for the most part, because it allows me to imagine her however I want her to be. I first learned about this from my husband, who then sent me to a video made by Chublot, so I'll leave that in the description too, and you can go check it out if you're curious to learn more about it. But it makes sense that people wanted this game that was based off of D&D 5e to be more like their tabletop game, and I'd argue that's how I feel about every character that is voiced in my stead, because it goes way back to the days before consoles had the capacity to voice characters. It goes back to reading them in my head the way I believe they should sound. And while I don't know if the younger crowd does this or not, in fact, I'm actually kind of curious, do you guys ever do this? Because I think if you tried it, you might find it's far more enjoyable than having the game tell you how they should sound. And since I just brought up 5e, let's try a different tact. Let's say you're making a new character for your first ever D&D campaign. You'll be playing with 4 people you know, 1 as the DM, and 3 are your soon-to-be party. You have to fill out your entire character sheet, you have to pick a race, you have to choose your class. If you're really taking it seriously, you should even come up with a backstory of how your character came to be where they are. And you'll also have to figure out how you think that character should behave at the table, and you have to be comfortable voicing all of the things that character would say or do. Right? It's the same thing with a RPG game. RPG stands for role-playing, and I do not believe that forcing a voice on the player helps them to role-play. In fact, it kills role-playing unless the only intent is for the player to role-play that particular character as the devs intended. And if that's the case, it shouldn't be called an RPG. We might as well call it Max Payne or Halo or Doom. But now that I think of it, even Doom Guy was a mostly silent protag too. Well, except for that one line where he just said, no. I think he also said something about ripping and tearing, but whatever, I'm getting off track. In the myriad of other games out there where you play as one particular character, being forced into one role is just fine, you know? But in a game where you are supposedly allowed to customize your own character, where the world is molded based on your own choices, then it doesn't make any sense at all to put that unique, player-driven character into a predefined box. That's just not role-playing. Role-playing is making a character and essentially pretending to be that character. Every time we do this, we join drama club and become an actor. What voice do they have? Are they like me? Or are they only like certain aspects of me? For instance, one of the best things about RPGs, games like Baldur's Gate 3, is that it allows us to explore things we might never do in real life. Like the other night on stream when I basically killed everyone in Grymforge except for Nier, which I kind of regretted after the fact, but you get my point. You can take any part of yourself and exaggerate it for your character. Are you kind of meek in real life? Always want to keep everyone happy? Well, if that's the case, sometimes playing a character that is the complete opposite of you can be incredibly freeing. If you're in character and people know that you're not just trying to be rude, but that's how your character actually behaves, then yeah, it can be really fun. For instance, that very same Kurd and Noble I mentioned earlier from my Battletech game. I used to constantly talk down to anyone I thought was of lower standing to me, which was basically everyone. It was a lot of fun though, and she became known as just incredibly haughty by everyone at the table. And as life happened, she slowly changed, and that should be a part of role-playing too, having a character that evolves and grows. But that's a topic for another day entirely. Whew, that was a lot to go over. Once again, I'm not trying to be preachy here. It's just my opinion on the matter, and I'd really like to see you all keep it civil in the comments. I know my usual crowd will, but for anyone new to the channel, we're chill here, so don't insult each other. I do want to know what you think though. I'm guessing it'll probably be split right up the middle as it usually is, but I'm also curious how many people fall in the center. Do you think it's worth the resources to make everyone happy, or do you think companies should just let the protags be silent and work on other features? I think at the end of the day, I would really like to see some real innovation in terms of the choices you're given and what can ultimately happen in your games. I want to give players more chances to finely tune their character and not force them to be someone they don't wish to be. It's going to take time, I think, either way, but if I had to choose, I would much rather see games focusing on making more paths to tread in games than more voices. I want to make a quick shout out to my patrons. Thank you so much, you guys, for all of your support. If not for these wonderful people, I would be but a pauper begging for scraps on the side of the road. Well, that's not entirely true, but it really helps. Not just with motivation, but with justifying the amount of time I spend making videos, which is hours. So if you'd like to help out with supporting the channel, head on over to my Patreon and pledge whatever you can. And if you're strapped for cash, you can always help by liking and sharing my videos when you see an opportunity to do so. Most places won't let you self-promote your videos at all, so it's definitely helpful to the channel when someone shares a video of mine on Reddit or a Facebook group, and a lot more people see it as a result. And speaking of getting more views, I'm still working on building up my new Creepy Girl channel. My original vision for the channel was to focus on classic horror games like Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, and the like, and then I thought it might be better to try a newer game to get more attention from YouTube's algorithm. But the new game I tried, this puzzle game called Madison, was just bleh. It was a puzzle-solving nightmare. I don't even want to finish it, to be honest, and I thought, why am I wasting my time with a game I don't even want to play anymore? I'm just going to cover the games I want to play and actually talk about. I might play newer stuff when it feels right to do so, but I'm probably going to spend a lot of my time with my old school favorites. So if you're interested in horror games and you want to see me play them and talk about things like Silent Hill plot theories and other interesting topics of the like, then head over to my Creepy Girl channel. I'll put the link down below and hit subscribe. And because I'm feeling just really appreciative of everything I have going on right now with this channel, I just want to say thank you to those watching this video and listening until the very end, and for supporting me in the many different ways you all do. Sometimes I get a bad apple on here who says something rude or nasty, but for the most part, you guys are a pleasure to interact with and make content for. So thanks. I'll see y'all later.